At 41, Ethan Walker was a homeless Navy SEAL veteran with almost nothing left but a faded backpack, an aging Chevrolet Suburban, and Shadow, the loyal German Shepherd who had survived war and loss beside him. One bright morning in Missoula, two wealthy women laughed at his worn clothes and mocked him for keeping an old dog when he could barely afford a home. Ethan simply walked away. But hours later, a retired attorney revealed something impossible. Ethan had inherited nearly 80 acres of forest near Seeley Lake, and a powerful developer was already trying to take it. On the journey there, a washed-out mountain road collapsed beneath his Suburban, leaving Ethan trapped as freezing water flooded the wreck and the vehicle hung above a creek. Shadow disappeared. Ethan thought his oldest friend had abandoned him. But what the dog did next would save Ethan's life and lead him toward a secret his grandfather had hidden for nearly 30 years. Before we begin, if you believe loyal dogs can be one of God's quietest miracles, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Missoula, Montana, early October 2019. Morning sunlight washed the streets beside the Clark Fork River, while cool mountain air carried the scent of pine beneath a clear blue sky. Except for Ethan Walker, the day offered little kindness. At 41, Ethan was a former U.S. Navy SEAL who had been homeless for nearly 2 years. He stood about 6'1", broad through the shoulders but leaner than he had once been, his body worn down by months of sleeping in an aging Chevrolet Suburban and stretching cheap meals farther than they were meant to go. His short, dark brown hair had begun to gray at the temples, and a closely trimmed beard connected to his mustache, sharpening the hard angles of a weathered, sun-browned face. A thin scar rested near his right eyebrow, while his blue-gray eyes carried the tired vigilance of a man who still noticed exits before furniture. Ethan wore a faded red plaid flannel shirt beneath a worn brown canvas jacket, a gray t-shirt, dark blue jeans, a brown leather belt, and scuffed brown hiking boots. A scratched military watch remained on his wrist. Although he rarely had anywhere he needed to be on time, his faded military backpack held nearly everything he still owned. Beside him walked Shadow, a 9-year-old male German Shepherd and former military working dog. Shadow had a black and tan coat with a dark saddle across his back, intelligent amber eyes, a slightly silvered muzzle, and a small scar at the tip of his left ear. His old brown leather collar was cracked at the edges. Age had slowed him, but not softened his awareness. Shadow watched Ethan constantly, as if the mission they had once shared had simply changed shape. Ethan entered a small outdoor supply store near downtown Missoula because Shadow's plastic water bowl had finally split along one side. Ethan had $23 in his pocket. He intended to spend as little as possible on a metal replacement and keep enough for food and gasoline. Halfway toward the camping section, he stopped beside a rack of winter clothing. His hand brushed a thick forest green wool coat. It felt warm enough to survive the kind of night he had endured the previous January, when frost had covered the inside of the Suburban windows. Ethan had awakened before dawn that night to find Shadow pressed against his chest, using his own body heat to keep him warm. The dog had been trembling harder than Ethan. Since then, Ethan had always given Shadow the better blanket. He checked the price tag. $128. A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "Maybe next lifetime." He replaced the coat. A woman laughed behind him. Ethan did not turn immediately. Linda Crawford, 52, stood near a display of expensive hiking boots. She was a tall, carefully maintained woman with a narrow figure, pale skin protected from Montana weather by expensive creams, and shoulder-length blonde hair shaped into a smooth, deliberate wave. Her tailored cream jacket and polished leather boots suggested wealth without needing to announce it. Linda had spent years beside her husband, Mark Crawford, a successful property developer, and long exposure to money and social influence had hardened her confidence into something colder. She was polite to people she considered useful and casually dismissive toward those she did not. Beside her stood Melissa Grant, 48, shorter and rounder, with auburn hair cut neatly above her shoulders and a pleasant face that became less pleasant whenever Linda gave her permission to laugh. Melissa rarely started cruelty herself. She simply seemed afraid of ever being the only person in a room not joining in. Linda looked from the coat to Ethan's frayed sleeve. Some people do enjoy admiring things they know they'll never afford. Melissa gave a quick laugh. Ethan felt the old instinct rise, the immediate calculation of distance, threat, response. Then he dismissed it. Words were not bullets. He had survived worse things than a wealthy stranger's opinion. Linda's gaze dropped toward Shadow. No home, but he keeps a dog that size. I never understand people's priorities. Melissa tilted her head. He looks old, too. Probably not much use anymore. That did it. Ethan's jaw tightened. Shadow moved before Ethan said a word. The German Shepherd stepped closer and pressed one shoulder firmly against Ethan's knee. Ethan looked down. During his working years, Shadow had been trained in tracking, search work, route finding, and responding to his handler's physical state. Even in retirement, he still noticed when Ethan's breathing changed. On difficult nights, Shadow would lean against him until the trembling stopped. He had learned to anchor Ethan without anyone ever teaching him the word for grief. Ethan rested a hand behind Shadow's ears. Easy, old man. Shadow looked up at him. For a second, the store disappeared. Ethan remembered another hand gripping his years earlier. Evan Brooks had been 26, a Navy corpsman with a crooked grin, sandy hair, and the irritating habit of making jokes during the worst possible moments. Evan had been wounded during a mission overseas. Ethan had stayed beside him, one hand pressed against the bleeding while they waited for an evacuation helicopter delayed far longer than either man could afford. Ethan had kept telling Evan it was coming. It had not come in time. Then there had been Thomas Walker, Ethan's grandfather, the broad-handed, gray-haired timberman who had practically raised him during the best summers of his childhood. Thomas died while Ethan was deployed. By the time the message reached him, the funeral was already over. After leaving the service, the losses accumulated differently. A failed attempt at steady work, savings disappearing month by month. The apartment surrendered, the Suburban becoming a bedroom. Shadow had remained. Ethan found the cheapest stainless steel bowl and paid for it. As he pushed through the front door, Linda's voice followed him. It's sad, really. A man letting his life become that. Ethan stepped into the bright Montana sunlight and kept walking. Inside the store, however, someone had stopped watching Linda. Robert Hayes was 67, a retired real estate attorney with a tall, slightly stooped frame, thinning silver hair, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and the quiet expression of a man accustomed to listening longer than other people found comfortable. He had built his career untangling property disputes across western Montana, and retirement had not weakened his memory for names. His eyes had settled on Ethan's faded backpack. A scratched brass tag hung from one of the straps. Robert moved closer. Beneath 30 years of wear, he could still make out the words, Walker Timber Co. Robert's face changed. He knew that name. 3 decades earlier, Robert himself had helped Thomas Walker prepare documents connected to a forest property near Seeley Lake. And as he stared at the door Ethan had just walked through, one thought refused to leave him. He could not remember Thomas Walker ever selling that land. That afternoon, Ethan sat beneath a cottonwood near the Clark Fork River, repairing a torn seam on his faded backpack, while Shadow ate from the stainless steel bowl they had bought that morning. The river moved steadily beyond them, flashing silver beneath the Montana sun. Ethan had almost finished the repair when Shadow stopped eating and raised his head. Robert Hayes was approaching along the river path. Ethan recognized the retired attorney from the outdoor store. His first instinct was suspicion. People rarely followed a homeless man because they had good news. Robert stopped several feet away, deliberately leaving Ethan's space. "Walker Timber Company," he said. "What was it to you?" Ethan's needle stopped halfway through the canvas. "My grandfather's." "Thomas Walker." Ethan slowly looked up. "You knew him." Robert nodded. "Professionally, a long time ago." The name pulled Ethan backward almost 30 years. Walker Timber Company had never been a great lumber empire. Thomas ran a modest operation on forest land near Seeley Lake, with a weathered cabin, a small sawmill, 2 aging trucks, and enough timber work to keep several local men employed. Ethan had spent summers there as a boy. Thomas was broad-shouldered, even into old age, with powerful hands, a square gray beard, and the stubborn patience of a man who could spend an afternoon repairing something rather than admit it needed replacing. He spoke little, laughed loudly, and believed land should be cared for rather than conquered. Ethan remembered following him through endless stands of pine, carrying tools too heavy for a child, because Thomas never insulted him by offering to carry them. After Thomas died while Ethan was deployed, the information reaching Ethan had been simple. The timber business had failed, equipment had been sold, debts had been settled. Ethan had assumed the land went with everything else. Robert's expression tightened. Thomas sold equipment near the end. That much I remember, but I helped prepare documents connected to the property, and he was very clear about one thing. He didn't want that forest sold. Ethan glanced at Shadow. That was almost 30 years ago. Land has a longer memory than people. The following morning, Robert took Ethan to examine the county property records. Ethan almost refused. Hope had become dangerous to him over the previous few years. Disappointment hurt less when a man expected nothing. Shadow solved the argument by climbing into Robert's vehicle before Ethan had agreed to go. Ethan stared through the open door. "You know I'm supposed to be your handler." Shadow settled into the back seat. Robert hid a smile. Hours later, they found the record. Ethan initially thought Robert had misunderstood it. Nearly 80 acres of forest near Seeley Lake remained registered under the Walker Family Trust. Several administrative changes had occurred over the decades, but no deed showed a completed sale of the underlying property. Then Robert pointed to the succession record. Ethan Walker. Ethan stared at his own name. For nearly 2 years, he had measured security in gallons of gasoline. A full tank meant heat, transportation, and another week in which the Suburban could remain both vehicle and shelter. He knew which parking lots tolerated overnight vehicles and which gas stations had bathrooms open before sunrise. Yet according to the paper beneath his hand, he had inherited nearly 80 acres of Montana forest. Shadow rested his muzzle against Ethan's knee. Ethan absently scratched behind his ear. "Apparently I've been doing homelessness wrong." Robert did not laugh. He had turned another page. "What?" Robert slid a notice across the table. Property taxes had gone unpaid, and legal proceedings concerning the abandoned property had already begun. A private company was petitioning for control and eventual acquisition, arguing that the trust had no active administrator and that the current heir could not be located. The company was Crawford Development Group. Ethan felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. Crawford. Robert nodded. Ethan remembered Linda's immaculate cream jacket, polished boots, and the casual amusement in her voice that morning. Mark Crawford, the developer, Linda Crawford's husband. Robert studied the dates more carefully. A formal review was scheduled in 13 days. 13 days. For a property Ethan had not known belonged to him until that morning, Robert continued through planning documents and public development filings. Piece by piece, the reason for Crawford's interest became clearer. Mark Crawford was developing an upscale resort project near Seeley Lake. The planned property itself was valuable, but access presented a serious problem. The practical existing route curved around difficult terrain and required additional engineering work, including a small bridge. Construction costs would be substantial. Robert spread a topographic map across the table. Walker land sat between the main access corridor and the proposed development. His finger traced a line through Ethan's property. It was dramatically shorter. "If Crawford controls this strip," Robert said, "he can establish a much more direct access route." Ethan studied the line cutting through the forest he remembered from childhood. How much difference? Potentially millions in road and infrastructure costs. Ethan leaned back. Only yesterday he had been calculating whether $23 could cover Shadow's bowl, gasoline, and dinner. Somewhere else, wealthy men were apparently calculating how many millions could be saved by running a road across land belonging to him. The absurdity almost made him laugh. "So they want my forest?" Robert shook his head. "No, that's what bothers me." He tapped the proposed route. "They don't need 80 acres. His finger stopped on the narrow corridor. "They need permission to cut through it." Ethan became quiet. For years, he had believed Walker Timber Company existed only on an old brass tag attached to a backpack. Now the name had become land, debt, deadlines, and people with money already positioning themselves around it. That afternoon, Ethan returned to the Suburban. He counted what remained in his wallet, then fed nearly all of it into a gas pump. The fuel gauge climbed slowly. Shadow jumped into the passenger side and settled down with the resigned expression of a dog accustomed to his owner making questionable decisions. Ethan climbed behind the wheel. Seeley Lake existed somewhere ahead of them, along with a cabin he had not seen since childhood, and a forest he had spent decades believing was gone. He turned the key. The old engine coughed before catching. Ethan looked at Shadow. "Let's go find out how rich we are." Shadow lowered his head onto the seat and sighed. Ethan smiled for the first time that day. Yeah, I don't believe it either. Then the Suburban pulled away from Missoula, carrying a man toward an inheritance he had never known was his, and toward a road that, according to the map, someone else already seemed to have plans for. The next morning, Ethan and Shadow left Missoula beneath a flawless Montana sky. Sunlight spilled across the pine-covered mountains, and distant stretches of water shone like polished glass as the old Chevrolet Suburban carried them north toward Seeley Lake. For the first hour, Ethan almost allowed himself to enjoy the drive. The fuel gauge sat higher than it had in weeks. Shadow occupied the passenger seat with his muzzle near the cracked window, and somewhere ahead waited 80 acres of land Ethan had spent most of his adult life believing no longer belonged to his family. Yet hope made him uneasy. Ethan had learned that expecting nothing was a crude but effective form of armor. A man could not lose what he had already convinced himself he would never have. He kept thinking about Robert's map and that narrow line Crawford Development wanted through Walker Land. Millions of dollars apparently depended on a forest Ethan had not seen since childhood. The absurdity still felt like someone else's problem. Eventually, the pavement gave way to gravel. Ethan turned onto an old forestry road leading toward the Walker property. The road was narrow but familiar in fragments. A granite outcrop, a bend between tall lodgepole pines, the smell of sun-warmed needles through the open window. Heavy rain earlier that week had carved channels along the roadside, though the morning sunshine made everything appear harmless. Shadow suddenly raised his head. What the German Shepherd stared ahead. Ethan slowed. Nothing moved. He continued around the bend. The road disappeared beneath him. Rainwater had hollowed out the soil below the outer edge while leaving a thin crust above. The Suburban's right front wheel punched through it. The vehicle dropped violently. Ethan jerked the steering wheel left, but gravity had already taken control. Shadow! The Suburban slid sideways off the road. Metal struck rock. The windshield fractured. An airbag exploded against Ethan's chest as the vehicle slammed into a pine, spun halfway around, then dropped farther down the embankment. The rear door tore open. Loose tools, blankets, and the new metal bowl flew through the cabin. Then everything stopped. Ethan opened his eyes to freezing water around his boots. The Suburban hung nose down between two trees above a narrow, fast-moving creek. Water poured through the shattered front glass. Ethan tried to sit upright and felt pain tear through his left leg. It was trapped beneath the collapsed dashboard. Shadow silence. Ethan twisted around. The rear door hung open. No dog. Shadow! Only rushing water answered. Ethan pulled at his leg. Pain flashed white behind his eyes. He stopped, breathing through clenched teeth, and checked everything the way training had once taught him. Consciousness, bleeding, mobility, exits, phone, destroyed, driver's door, pinned against a tree, windshield, partially crushed, left leg, trapped, water, rising. Then the tree beneath the rear quarter groaned. Ethan looked through the broken glass and saw exposed roots slowly tearing from wet soil. He understood immediately. The two pines were the only things keeping nearly 3 tons of metal from sliding into the creek. If either failed, the Suburban would drop farther, possibly roll, and Ethan would go with it. 5 minutes, 10 if he was lucky. He pulled again until his vision blurred. Nothing. Strangely, panic never came. Instead, Ethan felt the old battlefield calm settle over him, cold and precise. It was the calm that arrived when every good option had already disappeared. And with it came Evan Brooks. Ethan had spent years trying not to revisit that day. Evan had been badly wounded, and their position had made radio contact unreliable. Ethan had eventually left him with another man and moved uphill to establish communication with the evacuation team. Before Ethan went, Evan had caught his sleeve. Come back. Ethan had promised. He had returned, just not soon enough. The promise had followed Ethan home from war. Now he stared at the empty rear doorway where Shadow had escaped. For one painful second, some frightened part of him wanted the dog to return. Then Ethan hated himself for it. No. He swallowed. Keep going, buddy. Water reached his calves. At least one of us gets out. A root snapped outside. The Suburban dropped several inches. Ethan closed his eyes. Then a bark came from above. His eyes opened. Another bark. Shadow. The German Shepherd appeared on the ridge. And he was not alone. A pickup had stopped on the forestry road. Daniel Mercer, a 54-year-old local carpenter with a sturdy build, weathered square face, graying brown beard, and deeply lined eyes, was climbing out. Years of repairing rural homes had made Daniel practical and difficult to rattle. When something went wrong, his first instinct was usually to find a tool rather than ask who was responsible. His wife, Carol Mercer, 51, was a slim woman with short chestnut hair, lightly freckled skin, and a composed manner shaped by years working as a school secretary, where frightened children had taught her that calm voices often solve problems faster than loud ones. Shadow had found them nearly a mile away. Daniel later would explain that the dog had appeared in the road and refused to move. When Daniel stopped, Shadow ran back toward the forest, then returned, barking and staring at them until Carol said, "Dan, I think he wants us to follow him." Now Daniel saw the wreck below. My God! Carol immediately called 911 while Daniel grabbed a tow rope and steel pry bar from his truck. Shadow did not wait. He scrambled down the embankment, slipping once on loose dirt. Ethan saw blood along the dog's front leg. "Shadow!" The dog reached the Suburban and pressed himself against the broken opening. Daniel followed, secured the rope as best he could, then forced the pry bar beneath the crushed dashboard. "This is going to hurt." "Do it." Daniel pushed. Metal screamed. Ethan pulled. The tree groaned again. Again, Daniel leaned his entire weight onto the bar. Something beneath the dashboard shifted. At that exact moment, one exposed root tore loose. The Suburban lurched. "Now!" Ethan ripped his leg backward while Daniel seized his jacket. Shadow clamped his teeth onto Ethan's sleeve and pulled. The trapped boot came free. They scrambled uphill. Ethan crawled because his left leg would barely support him. Daniel shoved from behind. Shadow stayed beside Ethan despite his bleeding paw. They had climbed perhaps 20 yards when the sound came. A deep crack. The lower pine collapsed. Ethan turned. The Suburban slid from between the trees, rolled onto its side, and crashed into the creek below. Water slammed against the windows where Ethan had been sitting less than 2 minutes earlier. He collapsed onto the road. Shadow limped toward him and lowered his muzzle onto Ethan's chest. Ethan wrapped both arms around the dog's neck. "You idiot," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You were supposed to get away." Daniel stood nearby, breathing heavily. "He did." Ethan looked up. Daniel nodded toward Shadow. "He ran almost a mile to find us." Ethan looked at the blood on Shadow's paw, then into those familiar amber eyes. For years, Ethan had carried one belief like a sentence. Leaving someone who needed you meant abandoning them. Shadow had just done the opposite. He had left Ethan because staying beside him would have killed them both. And somehow, against distance, blood, age, and time, he had found a way back. 4 days after the Suburban disappeared into the creek, Ethan stood outside a small clinic near Seeley Lake with his left leg bandaged from ankle to knee. Nothing was broken, but the crash had left a deep cut along his shin, severe bruising around the knee, and enough swelling that the doctor had ordered him to stay off the leg whenever possible. Shadow had fared better, though not by much. 8 stitches closed the gash in his front paw, and the shaved patch around the wound made the old German Shepherd look strangely vulnerable. Ethan hated seeing it. Shadow apparently hated being treated like a patient even more. Robert arrived that morning to drive them to Walker Land. He took one look at Ethan limping toward the vehicle and shook his head. "You could wait another week." Ethan glanced at Shadow, who was moving with an equally stubborn limp. "We nearly died getting there. Seems wasteful to quit now." Robert opened the passenger door. "Your doctor would probably disagree with that logic." "My doctor owns a house." Robert considered this, then nodded. "Fair point." The drive was slower this time. Ethan watched the mountains through the window, while Shadow rested in the back. The accident had altered something inside him. Every narrow shoulder caught his attention. Every patch of washed-out gravel made his muscles tighten. Yet when they turned onto a safer approach toward the Walker property, fear gradually surrendered to recognition. The forest came first. Tall lodgepole pines crowded the road, their straight trunks rising toward a brilliant blue sky. Sunlight moved between them in long golden columns. The air smelled of dry needles, resin, damp earth, and something Ethan could not name except as childhood. Then the cabin appeared. Robert stopped the vehicle. Ethan did not move. The building was smaller than memory had preserved it. Moss spread across sections of the roof. Dust clouded the windows, and one porch step had partially collapsed. Beyond it stood the old sawmill shed, leaning slightly toward the trees as though 30 years of Montana winters had exhausted it. Rust had eaten through sections of the corrugated roof, but above the cabin porch hung an iron bell. Still there, Ethan climbed out. Shadow followed. They limped side by side toward the porch. Ethan looked down at him. "We look impressive." Shadow kept walking without acknowledging the joke. "Fine. You look impressive. I look terrible." At the porch, Ethan reached for the old rope and pulled. The bell rang. Its weathered voice rolled between the pines. Ethan closed his eyes. For one impossible moment, he was 11 again, running toward the cabin with Thomas calling from the sawmill, telling him not to slam the screen door. The memory arrived so completely that Ethan almost expected to smell coffee and wood smoke when he stepped inside. Instead, he smelled dust. Robert remained outside, understanding without being told that this part belonged to Ethan. Inside, time had left fingerprints everywhere. Ethan found the marks Thomas had cut into a doorframe to record his height each summer. Beside one line, barely visible beneath the dust, was a crooked E and the number 12. Ethan touched it. He remembered being furious that year because Thomas had accused him of standing on his toes. "You cheated," Ethan whispered. Shadow sniffed beneath an old table. A battered wooden chair still stood near the cold fireplace. On a shelf rested a blue enamel cup with a chipped rim. Ethan remembered Thomas drinking coffee from it before sunrise, sitting silently while the forest slowly became visible through the windows. In a kitchen drawer, Ethan found a folding carving knife. His breathing stopped. Thomas had taught him to carve with that knife. Ethan had produced a crooked wooden horse that looked more like a sick dog. Thomas had kept it anyway. Ethan lowered himself carefully onto the floor. Shadow approached and lay beside him. "I didn't make it back." The words came quietly. Ethan turned the knife in his hands. "He died while I was overseas." Shadow rested his chin against Ethan's thigh. Ethan had carried guilt for Thomas differently than he carried Evan. Evan represented a promise Ethan had tried and failed to keep. Thomas represented something worse in its own quiet way. A goodbye Ethan had never been given the chance to say. "There were too many people I didn't get back to." Shadow looked up. Ethan ran his fingers over the dog's silvering muzzle. Then he looked through the dusty window toward the pines. "But we made it this time." He stayed. Over the following days, Ethan cleaned the cabin slowly, obeying his injured leg only when pain made disobedience impossible. Robert brought groceries, basic tools, and several boxes for sorting whatever remained. Ethan repaired a broken window latch, cleared years of pine needles from the porch, and made the old fireplace usable again. At night, he slept inside the cabin instead of a vehicle for the first time in months. The first night, Ethan woke at 2 a.m. and stared at the ceiling. It took him several seconds to understand what felt wrong. There was no steering wheel beyond his feet, no windows fogged with his breath, no need to wonder whether someone would knock on the glass and tell him to move. Shadow slept beside the door. Ethan listened to his breathing until sleep returned. By the third afternoon, Shadow had developed an obsession with one corner of the cabin. Scratch, scratch. Mouse Shadow scratched again. If you find one, he's paying rent. The dog ignored him. Eventually, Ethan knelt and examined the floor. One board was slightly different from those around it. Its nails were older and had been driven at an angle, as if someone intended the plank to be removed. Ethan pried it loose. Beneath it was a shallow cavity. Inside sat a rectangular metal box wrapped in decaying oilcloth. Ethan carried it to the table. The latch resisted before finally snapping open. Most of the contents were ordinary family papers, faded receipts, and handwritten notes. But 2 items made Ethan stop. The first was an original forest conservation agreement bearing Thomas Walker's signature. Its provisions restricted large-scale commercial development and placed conditions on how the land could be altered. The second was an envelope. On the front, in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting, "For whoever comes after me." Ethan unfolded the letter. Thomas wrote about the forest, about stewardship, and about refusing to turn everything valuable into something that could be sold. Near the bottom, however, the letter became personal. "If you ever come back, Ethan, don't keep this forest because of me. Keep it only if you still believe some things are worth leaving behind for someone else." Ethan read the sentence twice, then a third time. Shadow sat beside his chair. Ethan looked around the cabin that had somehow waited longer for him than anyone reasonably should. That evening, Robert returned. Ethan silently handed him the conservation agreement. The attorney adjusted his glasses and read through the first page. Then the second. His expression changed. He examined the date, Thomas's signature, and finally the name of the conservation organization listed on the document. "Does this save the land?" Ethan asked. Robert remained quiet for several seconds. Not by itself. Ethan's hope tightened painfully. Then Robert tapped one line with his finger. "But this tells us where Thomas's other records may have gone." He looked toward the darkening forest outside. "And if those records still exist, Ethan, somebody may have spent 30 years hoping no walker ever came back looking for them." The conservation agreement did not give Ethan an answer. It gave Robert a trail. 2 mornings after opening the metal box beneath the cabin floor, the retired attorney returned to Walker Land carrying a legal pad covered with names, dates, arrows, and enough question marks to make Ethan suspect retirement had never suited him. The organization named on Thomas Walker's agreement had changed names twice since the early 1990s, but its surviving records had been transferred to a regional conservation archive. Robert spent the next several days requesting files, comparing parcel numbers, and following references buried in old correspondence. Ethan remained at the cabin, cleaning what he could while his leg healed. Shadow stitches forced the German Shepherd into an equally unwanted period of rest. Most afternoons, he lay beside the fireplace, occasionally lifting his head whenever Ethan moved as though supervising the quality of the work. When Robert finally returned, he carried a thick brown folder. He placed it on Thomas's old kitchen table. "I found 1991. Ethan stopped repairing a loose chair leg." Robert opened the folder. The first letter bore the name Charles Crawford. Charles had been Mark Crawford's father and the founder of the development company his son would eventually inherit. In photographs attached to an old business profile, Charles was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with slicked-back dark hair turning silver above the ears, a broad jaw, thick eyebrows, and a carefully trimmed mustache. He had built his reputation buying inexpensive land around growing western towns before roads and utilities reached them. People who had dealt with him described a charming negotiator who remembered birthdays, shook hands warmly, and rarely accepted the word no as a final answer. Years of turning neglected parcels into profitable developments had convinced Charles that patience could eventually purchase almost anything. In 1991, he wanted something from Thomas Walker, not the entire forest. An access easement. Robert slid the first proposal toward Ethan. Charles had offered Thomas money for permission to construct a road across the Walker property. Thomas rejected it. A second offer followed. Higher. Thomas rejected that one too. Then came a third. The language had become more aggressive, emphasizing economic development and suggesting that a road would eventually be inevitable as the region grew. Thomas's handwritten response consisted of less than half a page. Robert allowed himself a small smile. "Your grandfather was not a man who wasted paper." Ethan read it. Thomas had refused again. More importantly, he referenced the conservation agreement and stated that he would not allow the forest to become a commercial transportation corridor. Ethan leaned back, so Crawford knew about the restriction. Charles did. And Mark, that's what I wanted to know. Charles Crawford had died years later, and Mark inherited the company along with its records. The old road proposal apparently went dormant. For decades, there had been no reason to fight over it. Then the resort project changed the economics. Robert unfolded a current planning map beside the 1991 map. The resemblance was unmistakable. The proposed modern access route crossed nearly the same section of Walker Land Charles had tried to secure almost 30 years earlier. Only now the stakes were dramatically higher. Without the shortcut, Crawford development faced difficult terrain. Additional environmental review, longer utility runs, and construction of a small bridge. With access through Walker Land, millions could potentially be removed from the project budget. Ethan stared at the overlapping lines. His father wanted the same road, essentially, and Mark waited until nobody was here to say no. Robert's silence answered him. But the older files were not the worst discovery. Robert opened a second folder. This is recent. Crawford Development had argued in its acquisition petition that the Walker Trust had no active administrator and that the current heir could not reasonably be located. That claim had always bothered Robert. Ethan had not been hiding. He had been homeless, but he still possessed a driver's license, veteran records, and previous employment information. Robert had traced a company listed among Crawford Development's administrative expenses. It was an air location service. Crawford had paid them months earlier. Their report identified Ethan Walker as Thomas Walker's surviving beneficiary. It included his age, his military background, his last known employment, even information indicating that Ethan no longer maintained a permanent residential address. Ethan read the page twice. Something inside him grew very still. "They found me." Robert nodded. "They didn't fail to locate you." Ethan looked toward the fireplace. Shadow was asleep on an old blanket, injured paw stretched toward the warmth. The dog had crossed dangerous ground, bleeding to find two strangers because Ethan needed help. Mark Crawford had found Ethan too, and had apparently decided silence was more useful. He knew I was alive. Yes. He knew I was homeless. Yes. And then he told the county nobody could find me. Robert removed his glasses. My interpretation is that Crawford expected the petition to move faster if nobody appeared to challenge it. Ethan gave a quiet, bitter laugh. He thought a man sleeping in a truck wouldn't show up. Robert looked at him. Ethan glanced at Shadow. He underestimated the dog. Shadow opened one eye at the sound of his name, then closed it again. For a moment, Robert smiled. Then his expression became serious. "There's something else." Ethan knew from the tone that he would not like it. "The taxes are real," Robert explained carefully. Whatever Crawford had done, the Walker Trust had accumulated legitimate unpaid property taxes. The conservation agreement could restrict development, and the air location report could damage Crawford's credibility, but neither erased Ethan's financial obligations. Stopping Crawford was one problem. Keeping Walker land afterward was another. "How much time?" "The review is still coming. We deal with that first, but afterward, you'll need a sustainable way to pay what's owed and maintain the property." Ethan looked around the cabin. 4 days earlier, merely sleeping beneath this roof had felt like wealth. Now he understood that ownership was not rescue. A deed could give a man a home and a bill in the same envelope. Robert watched him carefully. "Ethan, I don't want you walking into that hearing believing beating Crawford automatically saves this place." Ethan remained silent for a while. In another life, obstacles had arrived with coordinates, objectives, and men beside him who understood the mission. Civilian life had been harder because failure rarely announced where it was coming from. But this was different. For the first time in years, the problem had a shape. Ethan folded the air location report and placed it beside Thomas's 1991 refusal. "Then we don't solve everything at once." Robert raised an eyebrow. "We handle Crawford first, then the taxes, then whatever comes after that." Like separate battles, Ethan looked at him. One at a time, Robert studied the former SEAL across the table and saw something he had not seen beside the Clark Fork River. Not anger, exactly, and certainly not hope. Purpose. Shadow woke and slowly rose beside the fire. Ethan reached down and rested a hand on his head. For nearly 2 years, Ethan had not known where he belonged. Now someone was trying to take the first place that had asked him to stay. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan Walker knew exactly what he was willing to fight for. The morning of the review arrived bright and cloudless over Missoula. Sunlight flashed across the Clark Fork River, and the mountains stood sharply against the blue Montana sky as Ethan Walker climbed the courthouse steps with Robert Hayes on one side and Shadow limping quietly on the other. Ethan had considered buying something better to wear. Then he remembered that nearly every dollar he possessed had a more important purpose, so he came exactly as he was. Faded red plaid flannel beneath the worn brown canvas jacket, gray t-shirt, dark jeans, scratched hiking boots, and the old military watch on his wrist. Shadow's stitches had recently been removed, leaving a shaved patch along his front leg. The German Shepherd walked carefully but kept his head high. Linda Crawford was waiting in the corridor. Her eyes traveled over Ethan's clothes before settling on Shadow. For a moment, Ethan was back inside the outdoor store. Linda gave him the same thin smile. "It appears your circumstances haven't improved much." Ethan looked down at his worn jacket. Then he met her eyes. "Actually, I found a home." Linda's smile faltered. Before she could ask what he meant, Robert opened the hearing room door. At the opposite table sat Mark Crawford, 55, president of Crawford Development Group. Mark was tall and broad-chested, with carefully combed salt and pepper hair, a square clean-shaven jaw, pale blue eyes, and the controlled posture of a man who had spent decades entering rooms expecting people to know his name. Unlike his father Charles, whose old photographs suggested warmth, even when he was negotiating, Mark rarely bothered with charm once he believed he held the stronger position. Inheriting the company young after Charles's death had reinforced a simple lesson in him. Uncertainty was weakness, and weakness was something to exploit before someone else did. The hearing began. Mark's attorney outlined Crawford Development's position. Walker Land had sat effectively unmanaged for years. Taxes remained unpaid. No active trustee had maintained the property. The resort project would bring jobs and infrastructure to the area. Crawford was prepared to resolve outstanding obligations and place the land into productive use. Mark spoke afterward in a calm, reasonable tone. Nothing about him sounded cruel. That made Ethan dislike the argument more. Mark described the forest as neglected acreage. Ethan thought of Thomas's blue enamel cup. Mark called it an access opportunity. Ethan remembered the iron bell ringing through the pines. Then Mark referred to the Walker heir as previously unreachable. Robert looked at Ethan. Ethan stood. Mark saw him clearly for the first time. Something changed behind his eyes. Mr. Walker. Linda, seated near the rear, turned sharply toward her husband. Ethan walked to the table and removed the scratched brass tag from his backpack. He placed it on the wood. Walker Timberxew. You knew who I was months ago. The room became quiet. Robert began with the heir location report. Crawford Development had paid professionals to locate Ethan. The report identified him by full name, age, military background, previous employment history, and last known status. Then came correspondence showing the information had reached Crawford's office. Then the 1991 records. Charles Crawford's repeated attempts to secure an easement through Walker Land. Thomas Walker's repeated refusals. Finally, Robert presented the original conservation agreement found beneath the cabin floor. Mark's composure began to fracture. The existence of an heir does not change the financial condition of the property, he said. Mr. Walker has not maintained the taxes. Robert nodded. That is true. Mark seemed encouraged. And the property requires substantial ongoing management. Whatever sentimental significance Mr. Walker attaches to it, sentiment does not maintain 80 acres. Ethan saw where the argument was going before Mark finished. Mark turned toward the officials. Mr. Walker is homeless. He lacks the financial means to maintain this property. The word landed differently than it had in the store. Homeless. Months earlier, Ethan would have heard failure inside it. Now he heard only a fact. He stood. Yes. Robert glanced toward him, but Ethan continued. I am homeless. No excuse. No embarrassment. I slept in my Suburban for almost 2 years. I learned which parking lots wouldn't chase me away, which gas stations stayed open all night, and how cold Montana can get when a vehicle is the only roof you have. He looked down at Shadow. There were mornings I didn't see much reason to get up. This dog got me up anyway. Shadow raised his amber eyes. Ethan did not describe medals or missions. He did not turn his service into currency for sympathy. He spoke only about Evan Brooks, the young man he had promised to return to. He spoke briefly about Thomas dying while Ethan was overseas. Then he spoke about coming home from service and slowly losing every place that had once made him feel anchored. I spent years believing that if you lost your home, maybe that meant you had somehow lost your right to one. His gaze moved toward Mark. I was wrong. The room remained silent. Losing a roof doesn't mean a man loses his right to come home. Robert stood beside him. And fortunately, Mr. Walker does not have to maintain the property alone. He placed a final document on the table. The regional conservation organization connected to Thomas's original agreement had reviewed the surviving records and confirmed the restrictions remained enforceable. More importantly, the organization was prepared to enter a long-term stewardship agreement with Ethan. In exchange for preserving habitat, maintaining the forest under conservation standards, and allowing controlled forestry research, Ethan would receive annual stewardship payments sufficient to address the outstanding taxes and support continued management. Mark stared at the document. The argument he had saved for last had disappeared. If the conservation restriction stood, Crawford could not carve its planned commercial road through the property. Without Walker Land, the resort access route returned to the longer alternative, requiring additional engineering and bridge construction. Millions in savings vanished from the map. The reviewing officials declined Crawford Development's request for control of the property. Questions surrounding the company's representation that the heir could not be located were referred for further examination. Outside the hearing room, Linda stood against the corridor wall. She did not smile when Ethan approached. She looked at his old jacket, then at Shadow, then at Ethan. For the first time, she seemed unable to find anything to say. Ethan could have reminded her of the outdoor store. He could have laughed. He simply nodded. Mrs. Crawford. Then he walked past her. Shadow followed. On the courthouse steps, Ethan stopped beneath the clear Montana sun. He was still wearing second-hand clothes. He still had almost no money in his pocket. His vehicle was lying wrecked in a creek. Yet he no longer felt like the poorest man in the room. Some victories, he realized, did not require humiliating the people who had humiliated you. Sometimes winning simply meant their judgment no longer had the power to tell you who you were. By the spring of 2020, Walker Land no longer looked abandoned. Snowmelt ran between the lodgepole pines, sunlight warmed the repaired cabin porch, and the old sawmill that had leaned toward collapse the previous autumn stood straight again. Its rusted machinery replaced by workbenches, hand tools, lumber racks, and the clean smell of freshly cut wood. Ethan never tried to rebuild Walker Timber Company exactly as Thomas had known it. Some things deserve to be remembered without being resurrected. Instead, he turned the old sawmill building into a modest woodworking shop, producing tables, benches, cabinets, and small custom pieces from legally sourced lumber outside the protected acreage. The conservation agreement kept the forest intact, while the workshop gave Ethan something the legal victory never could: work that mattered the next morning. As the stewardship payments stabilized the property, Ethan began hiring a few veterans struggling with civilian life after leaving the service. They arrived with different stories, and Ethan made a point of not demanding any of them. Nobody had to explain a divorce, an empty bank account, a bad year, or why answering a simple question like, "What do you do now?" could feel strangely humiliating. Ethan had 4 rules: show up on time, do honest work, help the person beside you when they need it, come back tomorrow. The 4th mattered most. Shadow became the unofficial supervisor. Every morning, the old German Shepherd made a slow inspection of the fence line as though the 80 acres represented a military installation requiring personal approval. At noon, he positioned himself across the workshop doorway where every worker had to step around him. "You know," Ethan told him one afternoon, "management usually stays out of the way." Shadow did not move. The men learned quickly that the supervisor was not open to criticism. At night, Shadow still slept inside the cabin near the door, but spring revealed what Ethan had been trying not to see. Shadow was getting old. The silver around his muzzle spread toward his eyes. His morning inspections became shorter. On colder days, he needed several seconds to rise. Ethan adjusted without announcing it. A mile became half a mile became a quarter. Then one clear afternoon, they were walking along a narrow path behind the workshop when Shadow's hind legs suddenly folded beneath him. Ethan was on his knees before the dog fully reached the ground. Shadow. The German Shepherd tried to stand. His back legs trembled. Easy. Shadow tried again. Ethan placed both hands against his shoulders. "No." Shadow looked at him, confused by a command he had rarely heard. "You don't have to." The dog's breathing was fast. Ethan lowered his forehead against Shadow's. "You don't have to prove anything anymore." The veterinarian's diagnosis came later that day. Dr. Rachel Bennett, 46, was a lean, medium-height woman with warm brown skin, dark hair threaded with early gray and usually tied into a practical ponytail, and steady hazel eyes that rarely looked away when delivering difficult news. Nearly 20 years treating working and ranch dogs had made her gentle without making her falsely reassuring. She had learned that people deserved truth about animals they loved, even when the truth hurt. Shadow had advanced arthritis and degenerative changes in his spine. Years of military work, hard landings, long patrols, age, and accumulated injuries had collected their price. There was no cure. They could manage his pain, reduce strain, and make whatever time remained comfortable. Ethan listened without interrupting. "How long?" Rachel paused. "I can't honestly give you a number." Ethan nodded. He understood uncertainty better than promises. That night, he moved Shadow's padded bed beside his own. At 2 a.m, Ethan woke to scratching. Shadow was dragging himself toward the cabin door. "Hey!" Ethan sat up. Shadow continued. For a moment, Ethan thought the dog needed outside. Then he understood. For years, Shadow had slept between Ethan and every possible entrance. In temporary quarters, motel rooms, the suburban, abandoned campsites, and now the cabin. The pattern had never changed. Shadow slept closest to the threat. Even now, with his spine failing him, he was trying to reach his post. Ethan climbed from bed and carefully lifted him. Shadow gave a quiet protest. No. Ethan carried him back. My turn. He settled Shadow onto the bed and pulled the blanket around him. You've stood watch long enough. After that, Ethan changed his pace. If Shadow could walk 100 yards, they walked 100 yards. If he wanted to stop beneath a pine for 30 minutes, Ethan sat beside him for 30 minutes. Ethan had spent much of his life measuring progress by distance. Shadow taught him that sometimes progress meant being willing to stop. One warm afternoon, they sat together on the repaired cabin porch. Sunlight poured between the pines, laying gold across the workshop and the replacement used Suburban Ethan had eventually bought after the accident. Somewhere inside the shop, a saw stopped, followed by laughter. Ethan looked at Shadow. The old dog's muzzle was almost completely silver now. Ethan remembered freezing water climbing around his legs inside the wrecked Suburban. He remembered the open rear door, the silence, the terrible belief that Shadow had left him. Then the bark from the ridge. For years, Ethan had punished himself for leaving people. Evan, Thomas, parts of his own life. He had confused absence with abandonment until the two words became indistinguishable. Shadow had changed that. The dog had run away from the wreck because leaving was the only way to save the man trapped inside it. Sometimes love stayed. Sometimes love had to leave. What mattered was whether it still searched for a way back. Ethan rested his hand against Shadow's silver muzzle. We're home, old man. Shadow's tail moved once against the porch boards. Ethan looked toward the forest Thomas had protected long before Ethan understood why. He had not returned in time to say goodbye to his grandfather. He had not returned in time to save Evan. There were losses no amount of courage could reverse. But he had returned in time for this. In time to protect the forest. In time to build the workshop. In time to offer other men a place where nobody asked them to justify how badly they had once fallen. And, most importantly, in time to sit beside the dog who had spent years making sure Ethan never faced the darkness alone. Perhaps that was what inheritance truly meant. Not money, not 80 acres, not a name printed on a deed. It was what someone placed into your hands before leaving, and what you chose to carry forward afterward. Beside him, Shadow closed his eyes beneath the warm Montana sun. Ethan remained there, listening to the forest breathe. For the first time in many years, tomorrow no longer felt like something he had to survive. It simply felt like another day he was allowed to come home to. Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come as a second chance, an unexpected road home, or a faithful dog who refuses to give up on us. Ethan's story reminds us that no matter how much we have lost or how far we have wandered, it may never be too late to find our way back. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope, and tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a small miracle from God? Please subscribe for more stories like this. May God bless you, your family, and the faithful animals beside you. Sometimes the miracle is simply finding the road home.